As one of the 4 stars on Chicago's flag, the Battle of Fort Dearborn is represented as a founding moment in the city's history. Walking over the Michigan Avenue Bridge downtown, you will see a bas-relief sculpture titled The Defense, which depicts the battle. It is one of many representations that ignore the broader context for the attack and depict Native peoples as savages.
This is non-Native historian Juliette Kinzie's 1844 narrative of the massacre at Chicago, and Potawatomi writer Simon Pokagon's 1899 publication, The Massacre of Fort Dearborn at Chicago, gathered from the traditions of the Indian tribes engaged in the massacre and from the published accounts. Analú María López, Huachichil and Xi'úi, Ayer Librarian, Assistant Curator of American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry, Co-Director of the Indigenous Chicago Project, and Co-Curator of the Indigenous Chicago Exhibition.
Kinzie's writing is generally known for having inaccuracies and exaggerating the influence of her relatives like father-in-law John Kinzie. But in this narrative in particular, her failure to acknowledge the broader context of colonial violence and her assumptions about the alleged superiority of white American culture are clear.
Kinzie was the first writer to call this event a massacre, and because of her family's status in Chicago when her writing was published, the term stuck and took on further life in representations of the battle at the 1893 World's Fair.
That's why Simon Pokagon's 1899 narrative of the battle is so important. Because he was writing for primarily white audiences, he still calls the event a massacre, but gives readers further context that is important for understanding the battle and draws on first-hand accounts shared by his father, Potawatomi leader Leopold Pokagon, who witnessed the aftermath of the event. When this battle occurred in 1812, violence against Native communities committed by invading settlers had been occurring for more than 300 years. American encroachment on Native lands was increasing, and Shawnee leaders Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were working with Potawatomi leaders from the Chicago area, like Maine-Poc, to organize a unified resistance to American invasion. In June of that year, Tecumseh and his allies laid out more detailed plans for war following several American attacks on indigenous villages, including Tecumseh's own village at Tippecanoe in present-day Indiana. A plan was formed to attack Fort Madison in present-day Iowa, Fort Wayne and Fort Harrison in present-day Indiana, and Fort Dearborn at Chicago at the same time in August. The attacks would be coordinated through wampum belts, small beads made from shells that were strung together to record histories and communicate messages. However, as Tecumseh and his allies made plans, war broke out between the Americans and the British, and Tecumseh and Maine-Poc immediately joined British forces in Detroit. Still, they sent regular messengers to communicate with their allies, and on August 14th, a wampum belt was delivered to Potawatomi leader Mad Sturgeon, signaling war should begin. Those at Fort Dearborn had been ordered to evacuate the next day, and it was an ideal time to attack the American garrison. The following day, Potawatomi fighters and their Kickapoo and Ho-Chunk allies attacked the convoy of American soldiers, civilians, and their Miamia allies about a mile and a half from the fort. There's no denying the battle was brutal, and many American soldiers and civilians, as well as Native fighters, lost their lives. But as Pokagon argues in his narrative, many Native people also came to the aid of white settlers. Potawatomis like Leopold Pokagon, Chichipingwe, or Alexander Robinson, Black Partridge, Shawnee, Wabunsi, Jacanash, or Billy Caldwell, and Archange, Wilmette all protected settlers they had built relationships with as part of the fur trade. The white settlers who had integrated themselves into Native kinship networks were living in accordance with Native protocols and were not seen as a threat to Native lifeways, unlike the soldiers and settlers who had begun to farm and settle on unceded land. The attack was ultimately a part of a larger resistance movement to American invasion, not a random act of violence. Indeed, the planned attacks on Fort Madison, Harrison, and Wayne were also carried out just a few weeks later.